So let's talk about the Hunger Games for this episode of Sci-Fi Pulsi. So we're going to talk about the nation of Panem, the districts, and the capital. So we don't really know what the disaster is that caused the apocalypse. Be it nuclear, global warming, an asteroid hitting the Earth, a solar flare. There's no clear explanation as to what caused the apocalypse. I don't think it's nuclear, though, just because there's no indication of there being radiation, nor is there a indication of a massive number of people dying from cancer. Because normally there's kind of a background for that. Like in the road, I would lean more towards it being nuclear because a lot of the older people are dying of an unspecified illness. And some other people went blind when there was these like massive flares in the background, and there was also so there was flares in the background. There was also, just if you go through the cities, they're all completely and totally burned out. So that leads me to think that it's nuclear in that case. But in this case, I don't know. There's nothing really clear that caused it, other than the fact that part of the continent is underwater. So I guess kind of the means of the apocalypse was rising sea levels. The cause of it, I'm not sure. The population of Panem is only about 2 million. So something happened that killed off, what is that, like 98% of. No, that's more than 98%. That's like 99.5 or something percent of America's population. Regardless, though, the foundations of Panem are shrouded in mystery. I don't believe we're given anything in the books, and so we're kind of left with guessing. Was it kind of like the Fallout universe, where there was this continuity of government plan, and the enclave emerged from this kind of the remnants of the U.S. government and army emerged from their bunkers, immediately took control, and reestablished a federal government? We don't really know. All we know is at some point in the past, Panem was founded, meaning Pan America, but also meaning bread and circuses. Bread and circuses is I think, the pun. Pan America, I think, is probably what the founders of the state wanted it to be. People don't really seem to have any knowledge of there even being an apocalypse, let alone there being a time before the apocalypse. We never hear people refer to the time before the capital, the time before the districts, etc. So at some point in time, Panem was organized into 13 districts plus the capital, under which the capital held total domination over the districts. My understanding is the capital is about 100,000 people, while the rest of the districts are about 180, 190. Sorry, 1,800,000, 1,900,000 people. Although I've also seen estimates that puts Panem's population around 4 million. From the research I did, I think the author says it's 4 million, but if you add up the official population statistics for all the different regions, it only adds up to 2 million. But regardless, Panem is a shadow of what America used to be. Why it's spread out across the entire country, I don't know, given the fact that it's smaller than most, like, it would barely have like a medium-sized city if everybody was living together. So it's kind of hard to tell. But at some point in the past, there was a rebellion against the arrangement. So kind of what the arrangement was, and we don't really know how bad it was before the first rebellion, etc. We also don't really know how the government works within the concept of the Hunger Games within Panem. Because we have Cornelius Snow, who seems to have been president for, I think, like 50 years or something. So he's obviously some kind of dictator or president for life. Maybe actually, we once again we don't really know. I mean, he could just win re-election constantly, or the oligarchy could just maintain him in power. So I don't know if there's fraudulent elections. I don't know if there's no elections. I don't know if it's just a state where the presidency is held for life, kind of like a monarchy. Once again, there's not a great deal of detail offered. But anyways, at some point in Panem, the country was divided into districts, each with a specialization, whose purpose was to serve the capital. Now, one of the benefits of having the individual regions as specialized districts is that the regions are all dependent upon one another for goods, and the goods are redistributed through the capital. Like Katniss's district, for instance, just produces coal. It doesn't produce bread. It doesn't produce beef. It doesn't produce electric. Well, yeah, it produces electricity. It doesn't produce lumber. They have to rely on getting that imported from the other districts, and that's imported by the capital, who controls the rail transportation networks. So at any time that the districts try to rise up, the capital can just cut off shipments from one district to another and basically starve them out that way, which is a very kind of efficient way of running things. So they have that beyond that kind of basic failsafe in beyond having peacekeepers and having other stuff like that. So the capital also maintains a fairly comparatively large armed forces called the peacekeepers. I believe the stuff is stored in District 3. I forget the exact it's stored in one of the districts, the majority 2, sorry, District 2. There's a huge mountain there in which they store all of their military hardware. It's like in a mountain. Why they store it in a mountain instead of storing it in the capital or spread out, I don't know. I guess they're just arrogant and lazy. But they seem to have a relatively large army. Plus, at some point, they seem to have restarted technological development because they have hovercrafts, they have holo projectors, mag trains, force fields, all these other kind of really advanced technology things. They also have like absurdly sophisticated genetic and biological manipulation. They're able to build entirely new species like the mockingjay. They're able to take dead people and make them into like weird chimeras and then send them back in the space of a day or two. The capital has absurdly advanced technology. And this is kind of where the narrative starts to break down. I can buy that there's this kind of neo-feudalist society in which the capital is able to kind of scrounge together technology from the old world, like helicopter gunships, tanks, that kind of thing. Maybe even like some spy satellites. And they use that against to maintain a position of control over the districts that lack any sophisticated military hardware. My issue with that is, if they have all these absurdly advanced technologies, why do they even need the districts? I don't get why they don't have robots do everything. I mean, we almost have the technology to do that now. And if they have the ability to build like these chimera creatures and like modify their brains, why don't they just make a race of Morlocks? Why do they have to rely upon people capable of rebelling? Why don't they just dramatically reduce their IQs and make them completely compliant and have them do anything? For the industrial districts, we have automated factories now. Just build robots to do it, or just get the peacekeepers to do it, but completely mechanize it. Like in the wood chopping district, they use axes. They like fell it with traditional axes. Why? Why don't they use chainsaws? Why don't they build like some big monstrosity that has like a bunch of buzz saws on it and will like, I don't know, it has buzz saws and mechanical arms, and it puts the wood into its back and it processes the wood there. They could probably do just as much with a dozen people. So the capital there's absolutely no reason it needs to maintain this very costly, difficult to manage and inefficient system. They could produce far more by just mechanizing output. So, like, we're supposed to believe that it's less effort to militarily occupy an entire continent and maintain a complex redistribution system than to just get a couple hundred people to build robots to do it and supervise the robots. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like I said, if it was just the case where they just had some pre-war technology and maybe they just had some kind of basic advanced weapons, it's kind of a misnomer, but like cruise missiles or something, or nukes, that would make sense to me, but that doesn't seem to be the case. They have absurdly advanced technology. So that's kind of always been my complaint with this whole thing. But that being said, back to kind of the history. So at some point the districts didn't like this arrangement, so all the districts rose up and went to war with the capital. And basically the war was a stalemate because they were led by District 13, which was by far the strongest district other than the capital. District 13 produced uranium, and the entire district is underground and highly industrialized and mechanized, and basically runs like a military, well, it's basically a military dictatorship in a lot of ways, similar to the capital. However, they later told people after the Civil War that it was graphite mining. Why they would need that much graphite, I don't know. That they'd have to build an entire district. I mean, they have a district that just produces wheat and a district that just produces fruit and vegetables. But they were supposed to believe that graphite and wheat production require the same amount of labor and they need the same amount of input. I don't, like, none of it really makes a lot of sense, but I guess that's just kind of what they were going for. So during the First Civil War, it was basically stalemate. District 13 at some point, I don't know if they had nuclear weapons before, during, or after, but District 13 came to a separate peace agreement with the capital that they would have their independence so long as the capital could pretend that they had destroyed them and that they had won the Civil War. So District 13 was just tired of the fight, so they accepted the terms and they were able to basically achieve full independence from the capital. So yeah, they became an independent state. They just had to basically pretend that the capital had destroyed them. So the capital just has a camera outside of the entrance to one of the entrances to District 13, and it just shows it as being destroyed. I'm sure they just go out other entrances or something. So without District 13 and its militarized weapons, industrialized warfare, the capital was able to defeat all the remaining districts, and the rebellion collapsed. As a punishment, as Bain would say, your punishment must be more severe, the capital instituted the Hunger Games, in which every year a male and female tribute would be drawn from each district, and they would be forced to participate in the Hunger Games, in which they would kill one another. They would fight each other to death, only one of who can win, and the survivor would be given money for the rest of their life. However, I think it was implied that the capital also set up like a sex ring or something where they hoard out the champions to be molested by capital members to show that even people who won the Hunger Games were not above the power of the capital. The problem is, so sometime after the Hunger Games were established, President Snow came to power. I think it's implied that he took power in some kind of coup, or he poisoned the previous president, won the election, and just has been killing off all of his political rivals. The capital has kind of been smart enough to pay off some of the districts. I believe it's District 4, 5, 2, and 1 that are treated a lot better than the other ones. And when the Civil War breaks out, they remain loyal to the capital. The Second Civil War, sorry. So by the time of the Hunger Games, it's been a quarter quell. I think it's this. I forget if it's the second or third one. But basically, they re-reap everybody who had survived the previous Hunger Games. So Katniss and Peeta get pulled back in. Just a note on the 74th. Yeah, it was 74th Hunger Games. So the 74th Hunger Games, we had Katniss and Peeta got pulled in, and they kind of did something where they kind of pretended they were in love. And because of that, they briefly changed the rules to allow two people to win the Hunger Games. However, what they wound up doing is they both said that they were going to commit suicide together and there would be no winner. And I think it would have been the first Hunger Games where there was no winner. And they decided to instead let the two of them win. So that act of defiance resulted in basically the rebellion starting to grow. And during the Quarter Quell, they re-reaped from all the champions. So most of the surviving champions were sent back into the Hunger Games for another round to show that no one was above the Capitol's might. Now, the problem with this whole system, and this is the problem that all military dictatorships have, that is governments in which the people in power rule solely through force, where there's no real attempt to normalize or legitimize their role. And I talked about this a lot in my New Republic video. The Capitol has really done nothing to attempt to legitimize its rule. I suppose they, in theory, have a fake constitution, fake citizenship, and they occasionally throw bread and circuses at the people. But despite all of that, at the same time, they treat all of the districts so horrifically that all of the people live in abject misery, and they really have nothing to lose by rising up against the Capitol. What's the Capitol going to do? Kill more people, deprive them of more food? They already exist at the edge of starvation. If the Capitol chooses to punish them by starving them, then the Capitol just lose the resources that it needs to survive, because it has no means of producing any of these things for itself. So that's kind of an issue, like I said, that a lot of military dictatorships have, where they're just the only tool they have is force. And once the people kind of just develop, I guess you could say, an immunity to where the government's made things so bad that the threat that rule by terror doesn't work anymore, or the people are just determined to overthrow what they view correctly as illegitimate state, it just kind of stops at that point. I mean, there's countries that have military dictatorship aspects, but that were a lot more stable because they sought to spread their legitimacy through other means than democracy. Like in the case of Franco with Spain, Franco restored the monarchy with himself as monarch, as regent, which was something very identifiable to the Spanish people. There was a form of representation. There were elections, albeit not what we would probably consider democratic elections. Workers had representation. There was a political party that anyone could join and play some active role in government. The Catholic Church was very involved with the regime. And there was just, in general, less of a reliance on terror and military occupation than in a lot of other dictatorships. In the case of Panem, though, the people have absolutely no skin in the game. So what winds up happening by the point of the Hunger Game books is the districts are just in such a poor state. There's begun to become rumblings that they should just revolt again, because there's no real reason for them not to revolt. There's also the issue, and this is an issue a lot of states have, that function this way. Not everybody within a country like this is a sociopath within the ruling class. And a lot of people in the capital, like Seneca, like Plutarch, a lot of kind of the other people have just kind of given up. They just don't want to continue the system. They're willing to kind of trade in some of their privileges to stop the, in many cases, almost genocidal treatment of the districts. So I think that's a point you have to keep in mind. It's very hard to behave in like a completely brutal fashion over a long period of time. I mean, generally speaking, government, like soldiers and governments, don't have trouble if they're dealing with guerrillas or terrorist groups or criminals or something. But to just kill civilians and people who are protesting is very taxing and very difficult. That was to a certain extent why during. Well, I'm not even going to talk about that because if I talk about the Holocaust, people get super triggered. But. Or they kind of had to switch over to gas chambers and that kind of thing. Because even kind of fanatical SS people had trouble just shooting civilians all day, every day. It was just too emotionally traumatizing. And it's, yeah, like in fiction, it's always somehow the entire government's okay with it. But eventually, like I said, there's going to be people who just like, this is screwed up, this has to end. So the capital itself, by kind of the point of the Hunger Games, there's a lot of cracks showing up, and a lot of people want change of the system. So you kind of have the catching fire thing where the tinder was very dry, and regardless of whether or not the whole Katniss or Peeta thing happened, there probably would have been some sort of second rebellion in the next decade, etc. Katniss just wound up being kind of a propaganda tool that spread things up a bit. So that stuff happened. You also had District 13 reemerged. They had spent the last 75 years getting ready for a total war with the Capitol, in which they built up their military, they'd built up their bunker system, they'd come up with a whole bunch of plans like destroying the Capitol's main weapon cache. And between them and the other districts, they were able to put up a good fight. Now, the Capitol probably would have won, but very, very early in the war, the vast majority of their weapons, soldiers, and vehicles were destroyed by an assault on their main armory. So in the aftermath of that, there was a battle for the Capitol, which left it utterly devastated and led the execution of most of the previous regime, including President Snow. Now, the leader of District 13 was going to declare herself president and establish a new military dictatorship in which the capital would somehow become the vassal, like kind of the vassal state. I don't know how that would work because the capital, I guess, produced advanced technology, but not really anything else. So how the capital was how that was expecting to work, I don't know. But Katniss wound up executing the interim president, and it's implied Panem became a democracy in the aftermath of that. So whether the district system was going to be maintained, whether the districts were going to become more kind of independent of one another and adopt a variety of different industries and not just have redistribution of resources, we don't really know. Without kind of the decades-long bureaucracy that had developed, assuming that they did a purge of sorts, it's quite possible that Panem would gradually fall apart and becoming extremely decentralized, or the districts would eventually, if they became more self-sufficient, just go their own way, and they would be completely separate countries with little interaction to one another. Once again, though, we don't really know anything about what happened after the end of the series, and we're unlikely to ever gain any insight into that. That being said, it was an interesting concept. I don't know if they really executed it very well. Like I said, if the Capitol just had pre-war weapons, that would have made more sense, but the absurdly high level of technology stretches my belief as to why the district system even exists. And we have to rely on the Capitol basically just being sociopathic in order to provide any sort of justification for it. So that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Sci-Fi Pulsi. More to come.